Welcome to the Hollywood Music Workshop podcast. This podcast is meant for all past, present, and future participants and friends of the Hollywood Music Workshop. In each episode, we interview and talk with lecturers that are going to teach at the upcoming summer workshops in Baden, Austria. And also this year, we're especially excited to not only be in Baden, but also be in Vienna at Vienna Synchron stage. And today I have the honor and pleasure to speak with renowned award-winning game composer Austin Wintory, who is the composer behind incredibly successful games including Journey, Abzu, Assassin's Creed Syndicate, Stray Gods, and Banner Saga 3, to just name a few. Austin is going to give a 6-day masterclass called Writing and Recording for Video Games, starting on July 14 and running until July 19 at the 2025 Hollywood Music Workshop. Welcome to the Hollywood Music Workshop podcast.
Thank you. Happy to chat with you and talk about our planned shenanigans.
Yep, I'm excited. And in the room with us, we also have Dimitrie Leivici, the founder of the Hollywood Music Workshop. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Excited to be here.
And feel free to ask a question if you like.
Okay, and very excited to have Austin join us and looking forward to the summer.
Good. So, Austin, I have a warm-up question for you, if you like. Have you ever been to Austria, and have you ever visited the Synchron stage?
So funny enough, I've never been in person to Synchron, though I have recorded my music there a fair number of times. It just always has been one where it turned out to be a remote recording, either because we just needed 3 hours for a quick pickup session or something, or in COVID, we used it because it was one of the first places to figure out a way to comfortably record, and everywhere else was shut down, and they said we think we can do it, and they did a fabulous job, and so I have been to Vienna, and I've been a tourist and visited the concert halls and the museums and been all over, and the city itself. But yes, ironically, missing this one part. So this will kind of close the loop of the missing halves of the equation, which will be very exciting. And then the funny thing is that it's just a precursor, because I already know I'll be back sort of not terribly long after we do this on a project. So it's very helpful to do some recon in the form of this workshop.
Oh, absolutely. I'm sure you will love it. I haven't recorded there. I was close to doing that with the project, but it fell through this time. But I visited the stage last year and I was so impressed. But just the sheer scope of it, it's very big. The hall's big, the control room's big, and the people there are very nice and accommodative. So, we're going to have a great time there in a few months.
Yeah, we do. I do an ongoing. I continuously write new music for Epic Games for their game called Lego Fortnite, which is sort of their parallel property to sort of OG Fortnite, or what's called Battle Royale, and we regularly record pretty lush big ensembles at Synchron for that game, and it's funny because it's a very ethereal score, very electronic by its nature. But then we slap 55 strings in there for a bunch of the cues, and then full orchestra on some of the others, and it's amazing how sometimes some of these cues are so simple where it's just holding, but between the musicianship and the hall, of course, as you say, my Lord, does it change the cues.
Oh yeah.
And so it's always a privilege. It's really I can't wait.
Yeah. And so I like the kind of level of detail here, because now we're not only talking about having a live musician, now we're talking about the specific hall where that live musician is and how that hall affects everything.
Oh yeah.
So
It makes a huge difference.
it does, and that's part of the reason we want to bring them onto this workshop. But so we'll get to the specifics of this workshop, because I'm sure people are excited about that. But many people do know you, Austin. And I had the privilege of meeting you in Malibu in June, and I followed your 2-day workshop then. But I would like to know, and if you could introduce yourself to our audience and followers, for those who don't know you, what you've done, and perhaps how you got started with music. A question that I always like to ask our lecturers is, what's your earliest musical memory? And has that somehow been important to you throughout your life in music? So that's a whole lot of questions for you.
Yeah, no, but they're all kind of interwoven in a double helix. Honestly, I can kind of tackle it from back to front. My earliest musical memory is literally essentially my first piano lesson. I'm a bit unusual in this regard in that I started somewhat late compared to many professional musicians and composers, because I was about 10 before I even thought of music. I didn't even listen to music. It was not in my life at all. You hear music around you on the radio and in the movies and that sort of thing. And I did have a kind of passing awareness of that. So many kids growing up in the 80s, and I among them, fell in love with Star Wars, of course, and Indiana Jones and things like that. So I sort of knew John Williams music and a few other scores without knowing I knew them. But I would say what happened was, I'll spare you the story to keep it brief, because it is a long and kind of strange story. But basically, my father kind of surprisingly challenged me to take piano lessons, and I thought that could be exciting. And I had this incredible good fortune of a piano teacher who was not a particularly classical teacher in his philosophy. He's a gigging jazz pianist who played around town, in clubs and at weddings and things like that. And it was principally a jazz improvisational type musician, but huge amounts of classical repertoire he was very comfortable with as well. And he was also a composer, and he had lived and worked in LA in the 70s, prior to my meeting him as well. And so he said, "What do you want to learn?" As opposed to the sort of traditional track of classical lessons, so-called classical lessons, where they say, yes, exactly. You must start with your manuals, your hand-in books, and all that kind of stuff, and we will make our way through. You will eventually be able to start tackling Bach. We will start with something, less technical, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. My teacher didn't care about any of that. And I'm the kind of person, I've always been a bit independent and sort of struggle with authority. And so had I been told this is how you're going to learn music, I probably would have bailed and had a totally different life. But because he said, "What do you want to learn?" I just kind of went wandering, but I also said, I don't know, because I don't know anything about music. I feel like I've heard the name Beethoven. I don't know though. And he said, "Well, let me share with you some of my favorite music." And he showed up to our second piano lesson with a stack of vinyls, most of which were Jerry Goldsmith. And it was just like instantly I was a different person. And the idea that you could be creative with music as a living was astonishing, because I loved creating. I wrote stories, I drew, I would make little movies with the crappy little camcorder, and I thought it could be a novelist. And I was also very passionate about video games, and I was already thinking, I could make video games for a living, even as a 10, 11-year-old kid. I didn't know anything about what that took, but just the idea of creating was exciting, no matter what medium we were talking about. I was sure I was going to be a novelist at one point around that age, because I was reading all these crime novels and things and thought, "Ooh, that's such a cool, I love that you can just invent stories." And so just making things was sort of the common ingredient of all that. And so, yeah, making music was suddenly the most appealing of all the different creative possibilities that I'd, tasted up to that point. And so my teacher basically said, "Oh, sure. Well, we can sort of frame your piano lessons around the idea of enabling creating instead of purely mastering the instrument or mastering the repertoire." And so that's why when usually people ask, "What instrument do you play?" I have to explain all that as a way to justify why I'm like a C- pianist, because it was always principally about using the piano as a tool. I mean, I'm okay, but mostly because I can improvise, I can bullshit my way into sounding better than I am, but I would never fool a real pianist. It's I can fool the uninitiated. And so, yeah, creating
That's
music
wonderful.
it became the goal. And then I got very lucky. At age 14, I went to high school. And by that point, I had already become a big nerd for music and composers. And I was buying a lot of soundtracks and a lot of classical records. And I was very fascinated by the orchestra in particular. I loved very experimental music. I think it's just anyone who makes things very quickly wants to go to the edge of what that means, and so you end up discovering all the kind of explorational music and even so-called avant-garde and whatnot.
So,
But
do you want to name a favorite? Would you?
well, a favorite of what in
Of
particular?
avant-garde, for instance.
Oh well, I mean, it's like there's different rabbit holes you go down,
Okay,
like
gotcha.
I remember loving like Non Caro, for example, and I remember loving John Zorn, and I remember loving of course the obvious examples of like John Cage and people like that. But also in the world of film, my favorite composers were like Herman and Goldsmith, who were far more experimental by default than the Williamses and the Alfred Newmans and the Tiomkins and whatnot. They may have their moments here. And their Franz Waxman of the early generation became one of my very favorites because he was sort of almost, in my mind, he was almost like the prototype Goldsmith, where he had tremendous technical faculty in the traditional vein, but he was always doing things unexpected in the midst of that. And that's to me what made Goldsmith the greatest. He could write a great tune. He could write orchestral music or big band or whatnot with the best of them, but he always had a twist. There was always an
Oh
angle
yeah.
that threw it off. And so quickly Goldsmith became an absolute favorite. And in parallel to that, Bartok became sort of my favorite from the other side of the tracks, as it were. And for the same reason, from both of them, they both looked at the palette of this beautiful tradition. And like I love the contrapuntalists, from Bach to Beethoven and Brahms and where you're looking at these people that are thinking so much about line, and Bartok sort of took that to these magical extremes,
Oh,
and
absolutely.
so did Goldsmith. And I listened to The Wind and the Lion from 1975, and it's just like this absolute masterpiece. And anyway, so yes, and when I went to high school at age 14, I remember I went to the school orchestra and I said, I've so far just wrote piano music for me to play at home. Is there any way I could put music in front of the school orchestra? And to their credit, the school program, led by a guy named Dan Levitt, said, absolutely, we'll play anything you bring us. And so for almost every day of high school, uh, I showed up with music, and then he would put me up on the podium and say, all right, take us through it. So I learned to conduct, and so by the time I went to college to actually get a composition degree, I had never formally studied composition, orchestration, or conducting, and I had thousands of hours of experience of all those things with an orchestra comprised of fellow 15, 16, 17, 18-year-old kids. But in a way that was even better, because if you can make them sound good, then you're, professional, it will just soar. At least that's my hypothesis.
And if
I'm
I
sure if I
may,
listen,
that's very close
please.
to how people learn to play in a band. And that's how bands form.
Right.
They just play music, and then that
Yeah, they just
becomes,
dive in.
they find their thing and they become, very successful. But that you just did that with classical, I think that's very wild. But please continue. That's
Yeah,
cool.
well, and it's crazy lucky because it didn't occur to me how rare an opportunity like that was until I got out into the world. I moved initially to New York City. I was growing up in Denver in Colorado, and then I moved to Manhattan and went to NYU, and then I moved to LA to finish my degree at USC, and I've remained in LA ever since. But starting with that first step kind of into the world and moving to New York and meeting, fellow composers and musicians in the program and at Columbia and, the Manhattan School of Music and at Juilliard and whatnot, and realizing as people come from all over the world, my experience of just having so much time of just practical learning in front of the students, where you write a note and the viola player raises their hand and go, we can't play this right. We'd have to detune our C string to hit this note. And you go, oh, interesting. 14-year-old me never thought to ask them about the open strings, and where does that, and what does that mean in terms of string crossings, and what is a double stop? And you just learn when your friends in the orchestra explain it to you. It's not from reading the Adler book or the Rimsky-Korsakov book or all these other,
The
ways
Piston
that
book,
book.
which I have here, the Piston book.
Yeah, yeah, the Walter Piston book, and there's so many. I got a whole shelf of basically all of them, and I also had like the Henry Mancini book on orchestration and stuff, and Fred Karlin's On the Track and all these other things, and but you just don't learn that way. It's part of why I'm excited about this workshop. Is you learn by doing infinitely better than you learn by hearing about it or reading about how other people did it. It's all well and good to say Beethoven orchestrated the brass this way, and then you listen to a recording of like Berlin with Simon Rattle, and it's sort of so flawless that it's almost not valuable as a lesson for a young person,
Oh yeah.
And so yeah. Anyway, I was very lucky, and I had never used a DAW or made a mock-up, for example, until I was in my 20s, and I had written tons of music by that point, orchestral music with full orchestra and choir and the whole gambit by the time I got to college. And yeah, it's sad actually that I'm so lucky in that regard. I wish this was more normal, but it wasn't, unfortunately.
Well, we're very lucky to have you because that's how you've written all this beautiful music, and we can enjoy that. So we're lucky, I think, as an audience as well. But I know what you mean, because when I went to the Sibelius Academy, I thought school is going to be like that. I show up with a new piece of music and somebody's going to be excited to play it, or even, forced to play it. But no, you really, as a young composer, you fight very hard for the opportunities to get your music anywhere. And in the hands of professionals, that's very rare. So yeah.
Yeah,
I
really
love that. And I love the fact that your piano teacher's favorite composer was Goldsmith. Isn't that cool?
Oh yeah, I mean he also had there's a composer that sadly, I mean, I've always, ever since he got me started in this road, I've become a bit of a nerd of the sort of the repertoire, as it were, and I love studying the canon of the Western classical and orchestral tradition and liturgical music and all that sort of thing, and even to a degree I spend a lot of time on the operatic tradition, but also just learning the cinema, the world of Hollywood and of video game music as well. Who were those initial people that built all this? Who were those Max Steiners and Eric Korngolds and Alfred and Emil Newman, and Alfred and Lionel Newman, and on and on from there. But then the second wave, the Hermans and the Goldsmiths and the Schifrins and all that. And one composer who was sort of big in his era, but sadly, if I went to USC today and asked who knows who this is, probably none of the students would be. It was a guy named Leith Stevens, probably most famous for the original 1950s War of the Worlds. But he also did Destination Moon, and then this Marlon Brando movie called The Wild Ones. And he was my piano teacher's all-time favorite.
Oh,
and that's
okay.
how I was first exposed to him. But Goldsmith, it was kind of between he and Goldsmith, because the first score I have any memory of listening to ever, outside of Star Wars and Indiana Jones and the James Bond films, the things I was watching as a kid, I remember sort of noticing the music, but having no real cognizance and not even thinking to look up the name John Williams until this piano teacher. But Goldsmith's score to the 1966 drama A Patch of Blue, and also the Franklin Schaffner 1970 film Patton, those I have vivid memory as a 10-year-old, him playing me those vinyl records. And here you have A Patch of Blue, which is this, it's a movie about the blind little girl developing this friendship with Sidney Poitier in the like segregated Jim Crow South, but she's blind, and it doesn't even sort of occur to her that he's black, and so everyone's looking at suspicion. It's a little white girl friends with a black man, and it's like the innocence. It's like one of those stories showing if you take away these things that we're taught to see, they don't happen. And so it's this absolutely beautiful, delicate solo piano built score. And then just a few years later to do something like Patton, which is, Patton to me is maybe the most perfect score ever written, because it fuses my old professor from NYU would say is the Dionysian and the Apollonian. You have the passion of Dionysus and the kind of the logic and the balance and the symmetry of Apollo. The idea of it's sort of the romantic and the classical coming together, where you have this score of these organ chorales that also function conveniently as a bass line, mixed with these military marches full of all this bravado of Goldsmith. It's like pure passion, but then also the immensely cerebral concept of, what if we record these trumpet fanfares into an echoplex, which is kind of like a self-degrading tape loop, where it can sort of mirror in an almost literal way Patton's belief that he was a reincarnated Carthaginian soldier and had fought in wars throughout human history. And it's so you get these concepts that are quite intellectual mixed with just the primal military march, that just makes you want to just go running, and it's like, and also on top of that, the smartness of the spotting of Patton, where you watch the movie, it's 3 hours and 20 minutes long. And I think there's 37 minutes of music in a 3-hour change movie where they go long stretches with nothing. And then it comes in like a freight train. And so it's just one of those where I look at it and it's like through every lens, it's smart, it's emotional, it's memorable. It's one of those, you can sing that melody back, by God. It's got all the things you could possibly look for in a film score.
Wow.
And to me, it's
because I only know that score of the 10 bars that's in the tribute to the film composer. There's a snippet.
You get the theme.
Yeah, but I haven't seen the movie and I feel ashamed, but I will watch it.
It's a great movie. It's one of those, very famously, George C. Scott won the Oscar for his portrayal of Patton, and Goldsmith. It's one of those that awards are interesting because they are always like sort of time capsules they're a blend of scores that turn out to be timeless and what turns out to be popular in the moment only. And Patton is one of those where Patton did not win the Oscar. Goldsmith has a lot of these stories where he kind of didn't get the acclaim, but history has proven him the champion, because it's like, name me who won instead. I'm pretty sure it was Francis Live for Love Story, which, is a lovely tune, but compared to Patton, which to me defines the art of cinema music,
forgotten.
And I feel like I can make a pretty good case for that.
By the way, did you ever get to meet Goldsmith? Did you ever talk to him personally?
It's funny. I've met quite a few of my heroes, but he's one of the only ones I never met him. I was never even in the same room as him. And funny enough, as time has gone by, I kind of like that fact because I get to sort of unapologetically put him on a pedestal because I knew he was quite a curmudgeonly guy the last 30 years of his life.
Exactly.
And,
he talked about him,
I mean, he wouldn't have liked me based on how I talk about him, but I have a lot of friends. I have a good friend, for example, composer named Neil Acree, who was a protege of Joel Goldsmith, and so he spent a lot of time with Jerry's son Joel, and as a result, spent some time with Jerry, and has stories of like shooting hoops with Jerry outside Joel's house, and so I've gotten some great Goldsmith stories from Neil, but also the best of all is. Sadly, he's also gone, but Kenny Hall, who was Goldsmith's music editor on 91 Movies, became a very close friend the last 10 years of his life. He was a teacher at USC, and we bonded when I was a student, and then we would go to lunch and dinner all the time, and he would have me come speak to his students, and Kenny became a real close friend. And I heard my favorite thing in the world was just go to lunch. His favorite was the Smokehouse right by Warner Brothers. And we would sit there and I would basically just tee up Goldsmith stories. And he would tell me stories of, like I said, literally 91 movies where he would just tell me the craziest. And it's like I essentially was just working through the list. I'm like, okay, 1995, The Wind and the Lion was recorded at Air. Go, tell me the stories. And so I got a lot. It almost feels like I met Goldsmith because I have so many intimate stories. Because Kenny saw him as his big brother. I mean, they went through hell and back together. And
wow.
And
well, the interesting thing was all the admiration. I can hear that, and we admired him too. Every time he came in, was starting playing his music was just incredible. But the funny thing is, every time we tried to get in some sort of a conversation with him, and God forbid you should try to get too flowery with him, like you would talk about something. He would just basically completely shut it off. Like, what the hell? You're absolutely right with curmudgeon. Absolutely right. But
it's so funny.
Phenomenal talent.
But I only have one story of Goldsmith. I, of course, never met him. But Conrad has this thing of. But when he was a younger musician, when he went to a masterclass with Jerry, Jerry said, somebody asked, how do you write music? Which is like a funny question, right?
It's also sort of how, I don't know.
How do you live life? What's the meaning?
Right, exactly. Yeah.
But anyway, so Jerry goes, I write something on the top, I write something on the bottom, and something in the middle. And what Conrad said that everybody started laughing, but he wasn't laughing because he said that, somewhere there in its simplicity is the truth of how you write music. And I keep thinking about that phrase and that quote because it actually is true. And what Conrad tries to say is that people often forget about the middle because they write a good tune, they write a decent bass, but they forget about the middle. So I always want to write something nice for the viola section. Hence Goldsmith's quote.
Preaching to the choir. One of my composition teachers at USC, we specifically he wasn't actually my composition teacher. He was my counterpoint teacher. We only focused on counterpoint. Was the choral composer Morten Lauritsen, and he one of the very first lessons he said is always make sure that the altos and tenors leave happy, because generally the sopranos get 90% of the glory, and then 8% of the glory goes to the basses, and 2% is then shared basically between the altos and the tenors. Yeah. And that applies to the orchestra as well. It's like the upper trombone parts and the violas and, the upper bassoon, like first bassoon, or the alto flutes, or the, English horn gets all the glory despite being an alto instrument because you only ever use it if you need a big alto melody, kind of a thing. So it's like there's certain instruments that it became my mission. In fact, one of my closest friends in high school was a viola player, a girl named Sarah Winter. We were very close. And I started writing from the perspective of I want Sarah to have a good time. It didn't even occur to me to think of it as a viola part. I just thought Sarah should enjoy this, I hope. And the principal was a girl named Rosie Thede, and the two of them sat as first chair viola and second chair viola for 3 years of high school for me. And it was always like the Rosie Sarah section, and I still to this day think of music that way. In fact, I frequently will put there, especially if it's a solo part, like when we did the London Symphony recording of the so-called Traveller Symphony, the Journey 10th anniversary, it's full orchestra, and then the solo line doesn't say cello, it just says Tina. And I that's often how I do it, because music is not made by instruments, it's people playing those instruments. And the more you personalize it and humanize it, the better it tends to go, and also the more fun it is.
It's a great aspect, by the way. That's a really great aspect, and I'm really happy that you actually mentioned this because that's exactly. Yeah.
And honestly, where a lot of that comes from is as a kid, when I was like a teenager, I remember Fred Karlin made a documentary about Goldsmith that I found a VHS of, and it all centers around the recording sessions of this movie, The River Wild, this Meryl Streep movie, and it's all being recorded at Todd AO. And so it's one of those where the movie is an overview of Goldsmith's career, but every 10 or 15 minutes, we kind of check in on the progress of recording The River Wild. It's sort of used as almost like a framing device for the film. And the thing that stuck with me as a kid, I had watched footage of John Williams conducting by that point. I had watched footage of these classic, you see photos of Bernard Herrmann standing up in front of the orchestra. But the thing that I had never thought about until I saw that Goldsmith footage at Todd AO doing that movie is he stops the cue and he goes, "Mike, bar 27, can you be a little more legato there?" And you hear Mike Lang from the back of the orchestra go, "You got it." Or turns to the cello section and it's Steve Ardoti sitting, and then he's like, you think we could be a little bit more aggressive in the bowing, and the idea that he's calling people out by name. Yeah. It wasn't piano, bar 27. To me, I always feel like when I travel to a new city where I've not recorded much and I don't know the musician's name, I always kind of feel ashamed that way, because in my mind that's not how it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be them. I remember I went and saw John Williams conduct Pittsburgh Pops when I was 16 years old. He was conducting during the window of my spring break of my second year of high school, and I begged my parents, "Can we take a family trip to Pittsburgh for spring break? Go admire all the glass and steel and then see John Williams in concert." And to their credit, they changed my life. My parents said yes, and my mom and my dad and I flew to Pittsburgh, and John Williams was conducting 4 nights at Heinz Hall with the Pittsburgh Pops and doing a night of Williams, greatest hits. But because of the time period, one of the most recent scores he had written was Angela's Ashes, which beautifully features Steve Ardoti on a bunch of gorgeous cello solos. And so because he always likes to perform something recent of his, in addition to, Star Wars and Indiana Jones and that sort of thing. I remember the first night of the show, we see it, and in the second half, he said, we're going to hear tonight the lovely Marsha Williams. He made some joke about her having the same last name as him, and he said she's going to play a bunch of the cello solos that I wrote for this score, Angela's Ashes. And of course, I already knew and adored that score, and it was so cool to see, this dynamic. Of course, he's naming her by name as well, which confirmed my feeling that that's sort of how it's supposed to be done. And because we went 2 nights in a row, the second day before the concert, the second day before the show had begun, I'm walking in the lobby and I see that cellist, Marsha Williams, walking around, and I walked up to her and I said, "Hi, I'm 15 years old kid from Colorado who convinced my parents to come, and we were here last night too, and I saw your solos in the second half, and you did a great job." And on a whim, I just said, "I don't suppose I could go backstage and say hi." And she was so kind of shocked that some teenager would sort of beg his parents to fly him across the country to see an orchestra concert. So she said, "Meet me at the stage door the moment the concert's over, and I'll take you back to John's dressing room." Wow. And so I went dutifully. He did, I think, 3 encores, and I stood there, and she showed up and took me back and basically planted me in front of the door and said, "I'm going to go home, but he's going to come out of here at some point, and good luck," and left me there. And I remember I was so unbelievably nervous because I had no idea what I was going to say. I didn't think any of this would work, but I was so, so I didn't know what I was going to say. And he came out and was kind of surprised. And I basically just stuck my hand out to shake his hand and said, I brought my parents, I convinced my parents to bring me here from Denver, and I'm still in high school, but I want to do what you do. And he's very gracious, as he always is, basically said, "Well, just don't give up and stick with it, and good luck," or something like that. And, it's sort of the trademark Williams move to be very polite and then go, "Okay, goodbye." Like I am not interested in, I don't want to sit here and get your life story, but I'm not going to be rude to you either. I felt encouraged, but I didn't walk away under this misapprehension that I had met my new best friend either. And it was very polite and very encouraging, but it was a brief little moment, but I couldn't believe I had shook his hand, because I remember thinking, my God, that same hand wrote some of the most culturally significant music on earth right now. I remember I actually struggled to fall asleep for about a week. It blew my mind, but it also, the thing that, as I digested it, the thing that had occurred to me was I realized how fundamentally normal man he is. And it made me realize I actually feel like I have a shot at doing this, because it turns out he's not this Olympus god descended to briefly live amongst us. He actually is a man. And that was so empowering to witness and to physically touch. So that's why I love that I never met Goldsmith. He gets to remain an Olympian,
Great thing, hang on. Great thing about John Williams is, I must admit, is the fact that anytime somebody in the orchestra had a question for him, he always would say "sir," or it was "madam." So it was really automatic for the guy to say, "Oh, sir," yeah. And quite often, when there was something not quite right, he actually said, "Well, maybe I could do it a little bit better," in giving the cue. And he really put himself on a level with us. Of course, we were always pushing him, the god he was. That's what people even ask, how come you guys are on your best behavior? So because it was John Williams, But the fact was, he had a certain way of addressing you personally, but still respectfully. It was "sir," by name and everything. I never saw him raise his voice. And he was always, he knew, as you said, exactly who these people were. He also knew about their accomplishments. Like, for example, when we had Stuart Kanan as concertmaster, he knew that Stuart Kanan was concertmaster of San Francisco Symphony, had won the Paganini competition. So he was very respectful of people's accomplishment. That's what made this band so great.
And Dimitrie, of course, you were playing violin on these sessions, for anybody that wasn't.
Well, it's so funny because he mentions the difference between Jerry and John. And the truth was that also when I said, because I one time brought a conversation up to Jerry, and he was almost dismissive, just like, ah. But you know what the best part about it is?
Uh-huh.
He put me into his book. He
No
wrote
way.
his memoirs. Yeah, and I didn't know about that either. I went one time up to him and asked him about A Passage in Congo, which was unfortunately not a very good movie, but the music was phenomenal. And in the movie, he actually uses a Romanian horror. That's when he pushes the people out of the plane, they get pushed out, and you hear suddenly this Romanian type of thing. And as we are playing it, I said, wow. So I went afterwards to him and I said, look, I was born in Romania, I'm Romanian. And where did this come from, Jerry? I mean, you probably said, nah, it's my own Romanian heritage and everything. I said, oh, I didn't know you were, so basically that was it. And years later, somebody came up to me, actually, John Chongo, whom you personally know. He told me, I think you're in the book. I said, what do you mean? He says, well, one musician came up to me and asked me about my heritage. And so basically, he brought this little in there. But of course, when first when I talked to him, he was very dismissive. But the truth was, I have to tell you one quick story only, because I'm always talking about it. His last session we did before he passed away. And he was suffering. He had cancer. We all knew that.
Right.
And
Looney Tunes, I assume.
He basically let us go a little early to strings. And we got up, of course. He said, okay, strings, I don't need you anymore today. We were Paramount when it still existed. And you guys can go home, and I'm just finishing with the brass and the winds. And then he bent over. So, of course, we kind of quickly packed our instruments to rush out. And as I walked by him, he looked up and looked at me and said, thank you. And he never really had said thank you to anybody much, but just the fact that he knew probably this was the last time he was with us, this was a real moving moment. Yeah. And I cherish this today, He had, about a few months later, we got the phone call, that he had passed away, and he was in pain. You really could tell he was in pain, but he still acknowledged us, said to us, thank you very much, and I thought, that's strange, just thank you. He's never said, just get the hell out of here, And, he had a very human side to him too, as curmudgeon as he might have been,
Yeah, I think it was more just that it was he didn't invite everybody in, but those who knew him as a absolutely wonderful, lovely person, and you talk to Kenny or like Sandy DeCrescent or the people or Mike Lang, Mike spent a lot of time with him because, especially like in the 80s when Jerry started doing these synthesizer scores where Mike was frequently the one playing them. So 2/3 of the score is just Mike. So, it was those who came to know him always, they wouldn't describe him as a curmudgeon. It was more just that it was hard to get through that shell for most people, but yeah, very different podium manners for sure, to say the least, between the two of them.
And beautiful story that you could never meet your hero and he can be on this pedestal, meaning Goldsmith, and then the fact that you met John Williams early on, and that the fact that you found the human side of him so inspiring as to, still being inspired, many years after. So I love that. I love how those stories are so different in a way, and how those people have still affected you so much throughout the years.
Yeah, I consider myself very lucky to I've been in the midst of just about every single one of the people who have really helped shape this art, aside from Goldsmith. Just about all the people that have been around in my lifetime, particularly in my adulthood after I moved to LA, I've had occasion to, very meaningfully interact with. And Jerry is sort of such a fascinating, very noteworthy exception. There's plenty of composers I would have loved to have met who we were alive at the same time. I never got to meet Basil Poulidoris. I never got to meet Michael Kamen. I never got to meet Elmer Bernstein. But also all of them died before I kind of, like that story with John Williams is unusual because I was in high school. But once I moved out here at age 20, virtually every name I just mentioned, they were gone, or very shortly thereafter. So, but I, similar to the Goldsmith story, I get so many proxy stories that I love hearing, from the Bob Townsends of the world who have so much to share in that regard.
I made a mistake by booking just a short conversation for us today. We should have another one of these.
Yeah, no, that's fine. We can talk about the workshop. That's no worries at all.
Well, on the risk, we're already a bit over time, so I'd love a chance to talk about the workshop. And I also had other questions, but I'll save them to, the after talk or whatever.
Sure.
But the workshop, it's going to be 6 days. We saw you give a 2-day workshop in Malibu, which was fantastic. I loved it. It was so much enthusiasm, very energetic, very organized. I loved it very much. So I can't imagine how, I can only imagine how great this is going to be. So what can the participants expect? What should they expect? And what should they know? And what should they plan at this point? We're now in mid-March. What should they do and what should they look out for even?
Well, so the first few days are, well, actually, I should say the very first thing I'm going to do when we sort of welcome everybody is for the the full most active participants who will be writing music, I'm going to outline their writing assignment because they only have a few days to turn around fully written or orchestrated, engraved parts to put on the stands in the Synchron stage. So in order to give them the maximum amount of time to think about it, I'm going to start with the assignment. And I suspect it's going to kind of resemble Sunset Boulevard, where our first shot is the dead body floating in the swimming pool, and the voice basically says, "How did I get here?" You're probably wondering why I'm floating in a swimming pool. So it's going to kind of resemble that, I suspect, because I'm going to give an assignment that might seem, pretty daunting since we haven't done any of the workshop yet. But I want the students to have the maximum amount of time to think about it and to be able to iterate on it as the week progresses. From there, I will then launch into a variation on the workshop that you saw, where I will spend the next couple days going through examples of my music and my projects with a very specific filter on interactive music design in games. It's not enough to try to write great music, and it's not enough to try to produce it well so that it sounds, it's well recorded, it's well mixed and all that. Those are kind of bare minimums in a manner of speaking. I really want the students to think about how to write music that can dance with the user, which is something alien to film and television and concert music and theater music and opera and all those things. It's something that is unique to video games, and that is obviously the focus of my workshop. That's what makes it different from Conrad's and from the rest, where I'm just assuming a certain amount of comfort with the craft of composition, because the point is to say, now that you've got that, how can we think like a game composer, or how can we think non-linearly? So the assignment is going to be involving non-linear game music writing and recording. And I won't reveal entirely, obviously, right now what the specs of that assignment will be, because of course I also want it to resemble like a professional situation where I'm frequently told on a Monday, "Hey, can you have a cue for us by Thursday? Here's what it needs to be able to do." So I do want to kind of simulate that, but I will say that we will be recording things that are to spec of a real video game scenario, and I'll be using a very recent game of mine that has been out for only a couple months as the template. So it will be precisely what I had to do, where it's not just write a piece. I think one of the strengths of workshops like this, there's the ASCAP workshop, and there's the old the New York Buddy Baker ASCAP workshop, and these sorts of things. Even like USC's full master's program, where you get to walk away with recordings of your music. That's all well and good, but I think if your interest is in game music, having an orchestral piece on your reel is not as valuable as understanding what it took to write a piece that is actually interactive. So that is my mission. So I will spend the first few days explaining a bunch of case studies of how I've done it, and then the next few days I'm going to principally let the students have time to write, and then we will meet to kind of check in and go through their work in progress, and I can hopefully kind of, because I'm sure questions will also arise as they are coming up with it. Well, how do we deal with this, or how do we account for, if there's no beginning, middle, event, if it's a loop, how do I solve for this and that, and all these kinds of things that are the bread and butter of dealing with game music. My goal is to spend the next few days really not talking about me and my work, but focusing entirely on these participants. And then, of course, we will go to the Synchron stage and record their pieces as real interactive game music. And then, again, I'm not gonna fully reveal the plan, but on the final day, rather than saying, okay, here's the piece, let's listen to it and discuss how we feel it went and give the students a chance to say, okay, what was easy about this? What was hard about this? I want to do all that, except we're going to play it back interactively. And so it's not hit play on a QuickTime. It's all right, let's see if we can break it. Because that's what I do. That's how I pay the bills, is I write a piece and then I go, okay, what would it take to destroy this, in the context of an interactive environment? And let's see how we all did, and go from there.
That's a real life scenario. And once again, at the Hollywood Music Workshop, it's going to be a safe space for music making anyway. So we're going to help you as much as we can. But that's a real great premise, because it's going to be a real life scenario, as you said. It's something that you.
The goal, to your point, to the point that you raise, the way you phrase that there, it's just to make it clear so that I'm not accidentally coming across. I don't want to come across like some military drill sergeant that's trying to make you quit. When I say when we try to break it, my point is we look for the stress test in the system. It's like when engineers are designing a bridge and they say, what's the maximum capacity that this can handle? And then hopefully there'll never be anything approaching that crossing this bridge, kind of thing. That's always what I do. Like if I'm making a video game score where this music is supposed to, a very simple scenario, the music is supposed to loop as I wander a forest. Well, I always ask myself, well, what if I wandered the forest for 2 hours? That is a reasonable thing. You play a game like Elden Ring, 2 hours is short.
Yeah.
So what happens if I write a 2-minute piece that loops for 2 hours? Well, 99% of players mute the TV. And so you go, how do you prevent that? How do you make them love it? How do you or at least don't make them hate it? These are the kinds of that's what I mean by try to break it. But yes, of course, the goal is that every student walk away having kicked ass, and that's why we're there to help them do that. Absolutely.
Exactly. And I think that sounds very exciting. I can't wait to be there and witness all of this. And the recording day, by the way, I have to tell you, it's going to be my 30th birthday, so I'm very excited for that.
Oh, no kidding.
Spending
Fantastic.
my birthday with you. And
well, let's write some interactive birthday music for you.
Please do. But I just want to ask one final question. I promise you this is the final question. So if I were now a student, and it's mid-March, as I said, what can I do to prepare for the military surgeon course? So what should people think about? Have their mock-ups ready. If you're a mock-up composer, should you be concentrating on getting your engraving and the other way around, or should you be thinking about more? If you know how to compose, should you be thinking about how to compose for a game? Because we don't know what kind of people will be there, but I know they're going to be very talented musicians, but they may have varied backgrounds in what they know about games specifically.
Yes, of course. Yeah. I mean, I think obviously if you think through the steps that it takes to go from beginning to end, having an idea, being able to actually write it, knowing the instrumentation that we will have, and being able to feel that you can confidently orchestrate and deliver parts and all of that, for that kind of a lineup. Things like, the setup in Pro Tools and being able to actually, facilitate the recording of this music. It's not just delivering sheet music, but being able to understand. For example, I'm not putting a criteria on whether or not the students want to use electronics or things like that. Virtually every score does. But, if they're writing something that's entails, crazy drum patterns and things like that are separate from the orchestration, I don't care about that. I have no aesthetic guidance for them. I'm not telling them, it has to sound like John Williams or something like that. The wider, more eclectic batch we get, the better. But the key is show up prepared to do that. To give an example, I frequently, I just recently did a series of master classes a couple weeks ago with the San Francisco Conservatory, and the students all were told in advance to choose a piece of theirs that they were working on to share with me, and then we would talk through it and whatnot. And one of the recurring themes of their works that they shared was, I intentionally was doing something that I was less comfortable with. Like a classically trained violinist was trying to write an electronic piece, or an electronic composer who's used to thinking in Ableton along a grid was trying to write a string quartet, or that sort of thing. And And I love that. I'm like, you should absolutely stretch in that way. My recommendation for these students is not to do that. My recommendation is you need to, if you know, you are, the stretch for you is going to be the interactive part. That's the part I want to be the stretch for you, because that's the part that I assume you've never done. And that's why you've signed up for the workshop. So while I applaud if you go, okay, look, I come from a very lush 19th century romantic sense of the orchestra. So I really want to write a piece that's very kind of, you know, Stockhausen-esque. I go, you're already going to have enough to worry about that. I'm not saying rewrite music you've already written. I don't want you to do that. That would be a real wasted opportunity, obviously. But I think it's okay to lean on your strengths compositionally and orchestrationally, because I'm going to be throwing an X factor at you that will be plenty to worry about. Yes. So that would be my advice. Now, of course, if I was a student applying for this workshop, I would hear that and go, challenge accepted, and I would not be able to resist throwing myself out on a limb and doing exactly the opposite of what I am suggesting, because I was a stupid person.
And that's exactly what we'll always have those.
Yeah, and so I'm not telling anybody what to do, but it would be my bit of sort of friendly advice, that no one's going to be mad at you if you write a very sort of traditional piece, if the interactive execution of it is bang on, because that's what I really want the students to learn.
Fantastic. Thank you for that.
Yeah. One quick question. Who was teaching at San Francisco Conservatory? Is that Russian girl, Daria?
Daria was there, who I've known. In fact, I wrote one of her visa recommendation letters when we first met, when she was a student there. So she was there. And Steve Horowitz, who was kind of leading the department, who had invited me there. Matt Levine, a composer who teaches there and who I've collaborated with on a game called Counter-Strike. We've done a couple of projects together.
Perfect.
I
was one of our participants many years ago. 2015, she was in our class.
I didn't know that, but I'm not surprised at all. She's very talented and what I love about her is she's in sort of typical fashion for her culture. She's a straight shooter. She will not hold back her thoughts. She will say immediately what she thinks, and I absolutely adore that. I'd like to think I'm pretty similar to that, and so yeah, we actually had drinks together before I flew home.
Tough Russian lady.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. I like those who are not afraid to say what they think.
Well, yeah, she was in our class. She was in Conrad's class. 2015, I think, or whatever. So did a great job with the recording session. But I never knew she actually was going to come to this country. Never knew that.
She did.
So, fantastic.
Yeah, and she's a very valuable faculty member there now.
Great to hear that.
So, with these words, I'd like to close the podcast for now. Maybe we'll have a second take at some point. But I thank you, Austin, for spending the time with us and sharing all this valuable knowledge and stories about Goldsmith I've never heard before. And thank you, Dimitrie,
I wish they were.
Also,
I love Goldsmith stories.
Yeah.
No, it's my pleasure. I'm looking forward to doing it. Obviously, I'm grateful for the chance to kind of advertise that we're doing this. You know, this is one of those things that obviously, you know, there's no hiding the fact that it's a big undertaking. Most people obviously don't live in Baden or in Vienna, and so, you know, they have to travel for it, and it can be quite costly, and the program itself is not the cheapest thing in the world. But my hope is that they were offering something of such value, you know, really trying to give them something that has never been available. I've done all these workshops when I was a student, and I've been a guest lecturer in all the rest of them the last 15 years of my career. And when you guys so graciously invited me to do this, I found myself thinking, well, I only want to do it if I feel like I can offer something that I've actually genuinely never seen offered at one of these before, so that it feels like no matter what it costs, it's a bargain. As I just really want it to feel like they've learned something fundamental and expanded their mind. And so really bending over backwards to try to achieve that and have a fantastic time and good food and all the rest of it. And so I'm really excited, and I can't thank you enough for inviting me to be part of it.
It's going to be fantastic. So thank you, Austin. Thank you, Dimitrie. And see you in the next episode.
Yeah, and see you in Vienna.